Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is Dune by Frank Herbert. Now, Dune is an epic science fiction novel published in 1965. However, an earlier serialized version of this book appeared in Analog magazine between 1963 and 1964. Now, Frank Herbert got the idea for the book when he was working as a journalist, and he was going to write an article about sand dunes in Florence, Oregon that were sort of creeping back into the town and creeping onto the roads. Like, it was almost as if nature itself was starting to take over the town, and I think the local government had ecologists plant grass to sort of stabilize the sand dunes, and he became fascinated with how humans can control and manipulate the environment, and there was this whole idea of man imposing himself on the world in which he lives. And this sort of germinated the idea of a story about ecology, but also this correlation between ecology and politics and even religion. This idea of man imposing himself not just on the environment, but on other groups of people. I believe Herbert was also experimenting with psychedelics at the time, and I think that definitely influenced the story as well. Now, like I said, an earlier version of this story, which was titled Dune World, appeared in Analog magazine, which was a magazine edited by John W. Campbell Jr., who also gave Herbert some suggestions on how to flesh out the story and develop the main hero of the story. Now, if that name sounds familiar, John Campbell also wrote the short story Who Goes There, which at this point had already been adapted into the movie The Thing from Another World, but would later be adapted by John Carpenter as The Thing. Now, the completed version of Dune was published in 1965 by Chilton Books, which was not a company that was known for fiction at the time. They were actually primarily known for publishing car repair manuals, but it was Sterling Lanyard, who was an editor at Chilton at the time, who saw the potential in the book, but it actually wasn't a runaway bestseller when it was first published, and it actually cost Lanyard his job. And it actually took a while for Dune to find its audience, but over time it became one of the most beloved and celebrated science fiction novels of all time, and now it's considered to be not just a classic of its genre, but there are some people who consider this to be the definitive science fiction story. And in so many ways, Dune is to science fiction what Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings is to the fantasy genre. And honestly, if you look at when this book was published, there really wasn't anything quite like it. Now, don't get me wrong, we had some great, thought-provoking science fiction that predates this from people like Isaac Asimov, Ray Bradbury, Richard Matheson, Harlan Ellison. But there was really nothing in the science fiction genre quite on the sheer epic scale as Dune. And what really differentiates Dune from so many of its predecessors and its contemporaries is the book is almost written as a piece of mythology. Like, in a lot of ways, this almost feels like Epic of Gilgamesh or the Odyssey in a sci-fi setting. Now, Dune is a book that's been on my reading list for years, and I'll admit, I've always been kind of intimidated to sort of dig into this, even though I've read books that are longer than Dune. But it's such a dense and multi-layered story, and I'm not going to claim I understood every aspect of the book, but I thought it was a fascinating book, and it's just a fascinating world to explore. And it is honestly amazing to me just how much thought and detail Herbert put into this story. I also think the book is a lot more subversive than you might expect. Now, I do want to give fair warning that I probably will mispronounce certain names and terminology from this book. Now, the plot of Dune is anything but simple, and to explain the plot in one sentence would be kind of impossible. Oh, you might hear some spice mining going on in the background, I literally can't control that. But the story is set thousands and thousands of years in the future at a point where mankind has long since migrated off of Earth and has colonized all these other planets throughout the galaxy and throughout the known universe. And for centuries now, human civilization has basically been under sort of an intergalactic feudal system where you have great houses controlling different planets, and the entire known universe is ruled over by an emperor. But in the story, the most important and precious substance in the universe is this spice called melange, which could actually extend life, it could expand your consciousness, it could give its users extraordinary abilities or even prophetic visions. There are some who even believe that the spice could put you in a direct line of contact with God. But the spice is only found on one planet, a near-inhospitable desert planet called Arrakis, which is home to these giant alien worms, some of which can grow to incomprehensible sizes, and they'll eat anything in their path, making spice mining very dangerous. But here's the thing, the universe needs the spice because all space travel is dependent on it. It turns out that space travel is controlled by this group called the Spacing Guild, who are essentially humans who have been mutated by the spice, and they can actually bend time and space with their minds and instantaneously transport spaceships from one solar system to another. So without it, human civilization in its current form would probably collapse, and it's also highly addictive, and if you become dependent on it, you could actually die if it's taken away from you. Now, there are actually humans who live on Arrakis, a highly religious race called the Fremen, who have trained themselves to survive in the desert, and for centuries they have been exploited by these great houses who have come to the planet to mine for the spice. And for several decades, Arrakis has been ruled over by the Baron Vladimir Harkonnen, a vicious, bloodthirsty dictator who views the Fremen as being not much more than vermin. But one day the Emperor switches control of Arrakis over to the Harkonnens' arch-enemies, the House Atreides, headed by Duke Leto Atreides and his son Paul. Now, Paul's mother, the Lady Jessica, who is not the Duke's wife, she's merely his concubine, she's actually what's known as a Bene Gesserit, which are basically this matriarchal religious order that have existed for millennia, who have been sort of secretly controlling things in society, working behind the scenes, and they have near supernatural mental abilities. Now, Jessica has been training Paul in the ways of the Bene Gesserit, and for years now, the Bene Gesserit have been trying to produce this super being that they call the Kwisatz Haderach, and it appears that Paul is slowly being groomed into being just that. But what happens is, one day the Harkonnens launch a massive attack against the House Atreides, killing the Duke and most of his soldiers, and Jessica and Paul are cast out into the desert. Eventually, they're taken in by the Fremen, and because of Paul's abilities, they start to believe that Paul is what they call the Lisam al-Gaib, a messianic figure from legend who is prophesied to be sent by God to liberate them from their oppressors. And Paul, as a way to get revenge on the Harkonnens, embraces this role and fully plays into it, and he ends up leading the Fremen in a religious war against the Harkonnens, and against the Emperor, who is secretly colluding with the Harkonnens. But during all of this, Paul must also come to grips with the fact that being a messiah has its consequences. Now, I know that was a pretty long plot description, but believe me, that only just begins to scratch the surface of just how rich and multi-layered this story is. So, the book, of course, touches on all these themes of ecology, religion, politics, and ultimately the abuse of power. And the reason I said the book is much more subversive than you might expect is because The book tricks you into thinking that Paul is the good guy. Now yes, Paul is the protagonist of the story, and to some degree you are rooting for Paul because he was legitimately wronged. What happened to his family was wrong, what the Harkonnens did to him was wrong, and the Emperor was corrupt, so in a way, he does kinda deserve this revenge. But in a way, he is just as exploitive to the Fremen as the Harkonnens or as any of these other great houses have been throughout the centuries. Because whether or not there is a god or some divine creator of the universe is irrelevant in this case because that's not what Paul is. Paul is merely playing God and playing into the Fremen's belief systems as a way to lead them against the Harkonnens and the Emperor to get revenge for what happened to his father. And throughout the book, Paul is having these prophetic visions of possible futures, and in a lot of them, he's seeing this massive holy war, this massive jihad against the universe, all in his name, and it appears that billions of people are going to die, and Paul might be powerless to stop this. Yet Paul keeps going forward with this and just embraces the power that it gives him. And yes, the Baron was a tyrant, the Emperor was corrupt. In a way, they kind of deserved to be overthrown, but at the end of the book, when they do triumph, there is sort of a sinister subtext to it all, where it's like, are they just trading one dictator over for another? And what the book very much implies is that Paul's destiny was not preordained by some higher power, but was set up by this cult, the Bene Gesserit. Like, even the whole legend of the Lisa Mal-Gaib is implied to be something that the Bene Gesserit implanted in this society centuries ago, and even prior to the beginning of this book, Paul is already being groomed into being the Kwisatz Haderach. Not so much by the Bene Gesserit themselves. They did not want Paul to be the Kwisatz Haderach. Jessica was actually supposed to have a daughter, but she went against the grain and had a son, and she's been training Paul to be this Kwisatz Haderach, this manufactured messiah. And Herbert has said that he really wrote the book to be a warning about charismatic leaders, and a warning about messiahs, or people who claim to be messiahs. You can have religion if you want, you can believe in a god if you want, but you have to be very careful if you start holding a particular person as a figurehead for your religion. Like, when you start calling a human being God, that's dangerous. And Frank Herbert has said that he really wrote the book to be a critique on the whole concept of the Superman or the superhero. He has said that even if we did find a superhero, it would be disastrous for mankind. But that's not to say the book is completely anti-religious either. The Fremen's belief system is shown to have value and is shown to be very important to them. And there is sort of a mystical element to the story where you could say that the spice, and particularly the water of life, really is connecting the human mind with God or some kind of spiritual force. Or maybe it's just some really good shit. But regardless of whether a belief system has any truth or value to it, it could still be controlled and manipulated, and a religion can still be used as a tool for manipulation and control. The book also has a lot of ecological and environmental themes, like the fact that the Fremen are trying to sort of terraform the planet. It's a process that will take years and years and years, possibly even centuries, but they are in the process of trying to do this. So again, it's this idea of man trying to control the environment. But the Fremen have learned to harmonize with their environment, whereas you have all these great houses who come to Arrakis to mine for the spice. And again, it's this idea of man constantly taking and taking from the environment, mining for precious resources, and it's kind of hard not to see the spice as essentially being an allegory for oil, because the spice does control space travel, it controls all energy in this future, so again, you could very much look at it as essentially being oil. Oil that also acts as a drug, which there are people in real life who huff gasoline, so maybe that tracks. But also, if you look at the spice as essentially being an allegory for oil, and you look at the fact that Arrakis is a desert world, and the fact that the Fremen's belief system is clearly based on Islam, it's kind of impossible not to draw a parallel between Arrakis and the Middle East. And the fact that this was written all the way back in the 60s makes the book honestly kind of prophetic. But there's also sort of a theme of colonization, the fact that the Fremen are essentially a native peoples whose land is being infringed upon by these outside settlers, or people who have come to exploit the land for its resources. And again, you can see this as an allegory for Native Americans, for the Aborigines of Australia, or any sort of native group whose homeland was taken over by invading forces. But while the book is very timeless, in a lot of ways, this is also very much a 60s counterculture novel in a way, especially if you look at the spice as essentially being LSD. Remember, this book was written in the midst of America's involvement in Vietnam and the hippie movement. Like, because of America's involvement in the Vietnam War, you had a real counterculture movement in American society that was sort of resisting against that, and the counterculture very much embraced drug use, particularly hallucinogenics like LSD. You had people saying things like, "It expands your mind, man." And again, in Dune, you have a drug, the spice, that expands the mind so much that it essentially makes humans godlike. So again, even though the story is taking place thousands and thousands of years in the future, in a lot of ways this is kind of a book about the whole 60s counterculture. Like I said, is the spice really getting humans in touch with God, or is it just a really good line of shit? Now, the book definitely seems to have a theme of fatherhood, the fact that Paul's father is killed in the Harkonnens' attack on House Atreides. And in a way, I do feel the character of Stilgar, who is the leader of the Fremen tribe who take Paul and Jessica in a way he does become kind of a father figure to Paul, but he also becomes one of Paul's most devoted followers. But in a way, I also saw the character of Gurney Halleck as sort of a surrogate father figure to Paul as well. Halleck was one of the Duke's soldiers who ends up reuniting with Paul later on in the story, and there actually is some tension between Halleck and Stilgar when they first meet each other. The theme of fatherhood could also be tied in with a certain revelation we find out about Jessica and the Baron. Now, the role of women in the novel is also really interesting. There are things in this book that are surprisingly pretty progressive for a book written in the 1960s, but then there are things that are very much dated to views and attitudes towards gender in the 1960s. And I've heard people debate whether the book is pro or anti-feminist. Like, on the surface, the world of Dune is very much a patriarchal society, yet you have the Bene Gesserit who have sort of been secretly controlling these great houses for centuries, so in a way, it's a society that is secretly run by women, even if it's controlled by men on the surface. Like, you have Lady Jessica, who's a very powerful and influential figure in the story, and in a lot of ways, a lot of what's happening is happening because Jessica chose to rebel against the Bene Gesserit. They wanted her to have a daughter, but she chose to have a son instead, because the Bene Gesserit can actually control the sex of their children. Like, in a lot of ways, Jessica is a rogue. What she's doing is not what the higher-ups in the Bene Gesserit want her to be doing. And then you have Chani. Is it Chani or Chaney? I've heard the name pronounced both ways, who is this Fremen girl that Paul falls in love with, and in a lot of ways, Chani is kind of a badass. She's just as capable a fighter as any of the male Fremen, and actually that's a point the book does make, is that the women fight alongside the men in Fremen society. But when Paul and Chani do fall in love, a lot of this character's agency kind of falls to the wayside, and she becomes submissive is not the right word for it, but she definitely follows Paul sort of implicitly throughout the story. Actually, in a way, it's kind of hilarious. Both Chani and Lady Jessica kind of become Paul's hype women, if you will. But as far as the female characters in the book go, for me the most interesting character would probably be Paul's sister, Aaliyah. Basically, in the beginning of the novel, Lady Jessica is pregnant, and the book is set over the course of 2 or 3 years, so by the end of the book, her daughter is like 2 or 3 years old, but basically, at a certain point, Jessica becomes the new Reverend Mother for the Fremen, and in order for this to happen, she has to drink what's known as the Water of Life, and it awakens it basically opens her mind up to the memories of all the past Reverend Mothers. But because Jessica is pregnant when she goes through this ritual, the same thing happens to the fetus of her daughter, so by the time her daughter is born, she has all these memories dating back centuries, and by the time the girl is like, again, 3 or 4 years old, she has the intelligence and talks like an adult. And Aaliyah is a very interesting character, but there's also something genuinely creepy and weird about her as well, and the Fremen children are afraid of her, and even some of the adults are afraid of her. Like, she's a toddler, yet she's a full-blown Bene Gesserit, maybe even more powerful than her mother. Now, of course, I gotta bring up the Baron Vladimir Harkonnen, who, even though you have the Emperor in the story, I would say the Baron is ostensibly the antagonist of the novel, and he is just a nasty character. In a lot of ways, he's tyranny incarnate. But he's also sort of a representation of excess and gluttony. The fact that he's so fat that he needs these floating suspenders just to support his own body weight. He's also a sexual predator. Basically, in his spare time, he likes raping young slave boys. Now, the book has had accusations of homophobia, the fact that the one gay character in the book is also the villain, and Herbert has expressed certain views that I do think are very ignorant, but I'll address that in a little bit. But just looking at the story itself, to me what makes the Baron such a repulsive character is not that he's gay, but the fact that he's implied to be a pedophile, because it seems like it's young boys he likes going after. Again, the Baron is fucking vile in this story. He's a vile, vile human being. But if we wanted to draw sort of a correlation between the Harkonnens and Imperial Rome, I saw the Baron as almost a Tiberius-like figure. And in speaking of that, in the novel, the Baron has 2 nephews, the Beast Rabond and Feyd-Rautha. Feyd-Rautha is the more significant character, I think, because essentially he's the one who, it seems like, is going to take the Baron's place. And throughout the novel, Feyd is trying to assassinate the Baron, and the Baron is well aware of these assassination attempts, and Feyd is also terrified of the Baron trying to assassinate him. But honestly, I saw some parallels between the relationship between the Baron and his nephew to the relationship between Tiberius and his nephew, Gaius Germanicus, better known in the history books as Caligula, who in some ways became even worse than Tiberius when he became emperor. And also with the implication that the Baron might be sexually attracted to his own nephew, it reminded me a little bit of the relationship between Tiberius and Caligula, because there are some historians who believe that Tiberius might have sexually abused Caligula, which might be one of the reasons Caligula ended up as fucked up as he was. But again, with the Baron's sexual deviancy, I saw it as more of him being like this Tiberius, or again, Caligula-like figure. That being said, from what I understand, Frank Herbert, he did have some homophobic views, or at least views on homosexuality that were very, very ignorant, which is weird because he actually had a gay son. He had two sons. There was Brian Herbert and then there was Bruce Herbert, and Bruce was actually gay, and apparently they had a very strained relationship because of that. Like, Frank Herbert could never come to grips with the fact that one of his sons was gay, which is just really shitty, but it's also not surprising because Frank Herbert was born in 1920. This is a guy who came of age in the 20s and 30s. I'm not saying it makes it right. No, it's not. But it's not surprising, and his views on homosexuality was probably the prevailing mindset among most men during his time. And again, I'm not trying to defend it, but it's also not surprising. But it's weird because it seems like in a lot of other areas, his views were actually quite liberal. I mean, look at somebody like H.P. Lovecraft. Lovecraft was notoriously kind of a racist, but I still enjoy a lot of his stories, and I can't deny the massive impact that H.P. Lovecraft had on the horror genre. But that being said, I can still separate the art from the artist. I could still read and enjoy this book and sort of separate it from what his views might have been. But all that being said, Dune is a very good book. It is a long and dense story. It's definitely not what I would call light reading, but if you're willing to put in the work, it is definitely worth it, in my opinion. And again, just the world building of this story, it is amazing to me just how much thought and detail Herbert put into this. Like, the politics and the history of this world is just so rich. Like, you get these little offhanded mentions of things that happened centuries or even millennia before the main events of this story, like the Butlerian Jihad, and even the different cultures that we see in the book, and the fact that a lot of them have their own language and terminologies. Like, this really does feel like a lived-in, living, breathing universe. And even though I spent a long time talking about this, I didn't even get into characters like Duncan Idaho, or Dr. Yue, or Thufir Hawat. And there are so many characters in this book. Some of the characters are a little two-dimensional, but some are actually very complex. One character, though, who I think definitely could have used more development was Princess Irulan, the daughter of the Emperor, especially considering the ending of the book. And she is supposed to be an important character, especially because each chapter in this book opens with a quotation from a history book or multiple history books that Irulan writes about the events of this story that she writes years after the fact. And again, it's that almost obsessive attention to detail that I really love, but again, she is a character who could have used a little more character, but from what I understand, this character does get developed more in the sequels to this. But yeah, if you're a science fiction fan, I feel Dune is one of those books that you should try giving a read at least once. Just be prepared for what you're getting yourself into. It is kind of a commitment. Now, while Frank Herbert wrote Dune as a standalone novel, he would later write several sequels to this. You had Dune Messiah, Children of Dune, God Emperor of Dune, Heretics of Dune, and then Chapter House Dune was the final novel before Frank Herbert's death in 1986. But Herbert's son Brian, along with Kevin J. Anderson, would continue the series 2 decades after the final Dune novel from Frank Herbert was published. And ironically now, I actually think there are more Brian Herbert Dune novels than there were in the original series from his father. Now, Dune is a story that's been adapted several times now, but before we got any of the adaptations that we did, this was a book that was considered to be virtually unfilmable. But that wasn't for lack of trying. They had been trying to do a Dune movie since the late 1960s, especially with movies like Planet of the Apes in 2001, giving science fiction a new prestige that it didn't really have before, at least not in American cinema at the time. I know at a certain point Roger Corman tried to get the rights to the book, but obviously nothing became of that. But in 1971, the rights were purchased by producer Arthur P. Jacobs, who had produced Planet of the Apes and its sequels. And Jacobs wanted this Dune project to be helmed by David Lean, who had previously directed Lawrence of Arabia. Unfortunately, Jacobs passed away of a heart attack in 1973, so obviously nothing became of this Dune project. But in 1974, the rights to the book were purchased by French producer Jean-Paul Gibbon, and he approached Chilean filmmaker Alejandro Jodorowsky, who had previously directed El Topo and The Holy Mountain, about directing this upcoming Dune adaptation. And Jodorowsky's Dune is kinda the stuff of legend. Like, it's considered to be the most famous film never made. And from everything I've heard about Jodorowsky's failed Dune adaptation, it sounds like it was gonna be fucking insane. Like, it was either gonna be one of the best or one of the worst movies ever made. It was, like, supposed to be this huge 10-hour epic. It was gonna feature people like Orson Welles, Mick Jagger, Udo Kier. Salvador Dali was supposed to play the Emperor. Jodorowsky hired people like Mobius and H.R. Giger to design the different planets. It was going to feature a soundtrack by Tangerine Dream and Pink Floyd. And they actually got pretty far into pre-production on this movie. Apparently Jodorowsky spent a good 2 years of his life working on this. But ultimately the project died when no studio would back it. And I hate to say it, it's not surprising, because even though the movie going public in the 70s was probably at its most open-minded, I have a feeling a lot of people would have had trouble accepting a 10-hour-long movie. But ultimately, we'll never know how Jodorowsky's Dune would have turned out, but whether it was good or bad, it probably would have been a hell of an experience. Especially if you see his other movies, like Holy Mountain. Now, I don't do any drugs, but Holy Mountain really is sort of the cinematic equivalent of an acid trip, so I really would have been interested to see what this guy would have done with the Dune universe. Now, this doomed production was actually the basis for the 2013 documentary Jodorowsky's Dune, and oddly enough, it did kind of lead to Alien, believe it or not, because Dan O'Bannon, who would go on to write Alien, was supposed to do effects work on Jodorowsky's Dune, and like I said, H.R. Giger was one of the conceptual artists who was hired by Jodorowsky, and Giger would go on to design the xenomorph in Alien, and he designed the derelict alien spacecraft and the space jockey, and I think some of his conceptual art for Dune did carry over into Alien, but eventually the rights to the book were purchased by Italian producer Dino De Laurentiis, and right after the success of Alien, he hired Ridley Scott to direct this Dune adaptation. And ironically, H.R. Giger was once again hired to design the worms, and I think do some of the set design for Ridley Scott's Unmade Dune movie, and I know Scott wanted Harlan Ellison to write the screenplay. Unfortunately, production on this movie was cut short when Ridley Scott's brother Frank died of cancer. So, this movie never came to fruition. Scott would end up doing the movie Blade Runner, which was based on another great science fiction novel, Philip K. Dick's Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. But we finally got a Dune movie in 1984. Dino De Laurentiis was still involved, but the film was primarily produced by his daughter Raffaella, who at the time I think was the youngest female producer on a movie of this caliber, and she hired David Lynch to direct. Now, Lynch at this point had only done 2 other movies, that being the 1977 surrealist horror film Eraserhead and the 1980 biographical drama film The Elephant Man, and he would go on to direct movies like Blue Velvet, Lost Highway, Mulholland Drive, and he created the series Twin Peaks. He's unfortunately no longer with us. He passed away earlier this year. Now, the film stars Kyle MacLachlan, who would go on to work with Lynch in Blue Velvet and Twin Peaks as Paul Atreides, or Muad'Dib. And despite being 10 years older than the character was in the book, MacLachlan is still quite good in the role, and was was apparently a huge fan of the book. You also had Jurgen Prochnow as Duke Leto Atreides, Francesca Annis as Lady Jessica, Dean Stockwell as Dr. Yue, Max von Sydow as Liet Kynes, Linda Hunt as the Shadout Mapes, Patrick Stewart as Gurney Halleck, Brad Dourif, who most people would recognize as Billy Bibbit from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and as the voice of Chucky in the Child's Play movies, as the Baron's Mentat Piter, Sean Young as Chani, Everett McGill as Stilgar, Jose Ferrer as the Emperor, Virginia Madsen, who would go on to play Helen Lyle in Candyman as Princess Irulan. You have a very young Alyssa Witt as Paul's sister Aaliyah, Jack Nance, who played Henry in Eraserhead, has a small role in the movie, and then you have fucking Sting from The Police as Feyd-Rautha. And then you have Kenneth McMillan, who is both kind of amazing and kind of painfully over the top as Baron Vladimir Harkonnen. Like, seriously, in some ways he does kind of steal the movie, but in other ways he's almost a cartoon character in this. Now, the movie, much like the book, has had accusations of homophobia because the Baron is a gay character, but like I said, my interpretation of him in the book is that he's much more of a pedophile, where for the movie, because it would be very difficult to show something like that, we just see him going after, like, young men in the movie, and he comes off as more of, like, a predatory homosexual, and not that you can't have a gay villain, but there's ways to do it a little more tactfully. And the fact that the Baron is portrayed as being diseased and he has all these boils on his face, it's not a very good look considering that this came out during the height of the AIDS epidemic. Granted, I don't think there was any intentional homophobia on David Lynch's part, but again, it's something that if you look at it by today's standards and you look at it in retrospect, again, it's not a very good look for the movie. Now, for the film's cinematography, David Lynch reunited with Freddie Francis, who previously worked with him on The Elephant Man. Now, Freddie Francis also directed several horror films for Hammer and Amicus, like The Evil of Frankenstein, Dr. Terror's House of Horrors, and Tales from the Crypt. Now, the David Lynch film is kind of a mixed bag for me. I first saw it when I was a teenager, where I was really starting to get into David Lynch, and I do like it, but it's also a mess. It really is. But I don't think it's David Lynch's fault. He wanted it to be a 3-hour movie, but he did not have final cut, and the studio, Universal, forced him to cut it down to 2 hours, and as a result, the movie really does feel like a collection of random scenes sort of just strung together. And you get no real character development, probably because a lot of character scenes ended up on the cutting room floor. And the movie honestly is kind of incomprehensible unless you've read the book. Like, when you watch the movie, you can really tell entire scenes, entire sections of the film were cut out. Especially in the second half of the movie, where basically an entire third of the novel is sort of pared down into a montage sequence where you have Virginia Madsen as Princess Irulan narrating it, sort of explaining to us what happened. Like, characters who were so important in the book are kind of just non-characters in the movie, like Duncan Idaho. Duncan Idaho is in the movie, but like when he gets killed, you're kind of like, who the fuck was this? Like, Chani, who is such an important character in the novel, barely has any character in the movie. Like, that montage sequence that I mentioned, we get like a random shot of Kyle MacLachlan and Sean Young kissing, and we just hear Virginia Madsen saying, Paul and Chani's love grew. Well, thanks for telling us, but can we actually see that instead of you telling us so we can actually, I don't know, care about this relationship? Now, when the movie came out in December of 1984, it was a critical and commercial disaster. Siskel and Ebert called it the worst movie of the year. And they were not alone. Critics savaged the movie. And David Lynch considered it to be his worst movie. It was the only movie he did where he did not have final cut, and I think he really considered it to be his sellout movie. Now, there was an expanded version of the film which aired on television a few years later, but even that version David Lynch is not happy with. Actually, that version Lynch has completely disowned, and if you see the TV version, it says directed by Alan Smithy, which is sort of a shared pseudonym that some directors used to use if they wanted their names taken off a film. I also think one of the things that hurt this movie was at the time the film was marketed towards kids, and when you watch the movie, this is clearly not a kids' film at all. Also, this was coming right off the heels of Return of the Jedi, which ironically David Lynch was offered a chance to direct. And I think parents probably took their kids to see this movie expecting it to be like Star Wars, and were probably in for a huge shock when you see these giant worms that look like penises, this hideous fat man with boils over his face, and a little demon girl at the end. Like, I'm sure people in 1984 were like, what the fuck is this? It also probably doesn't help matters that there was a toy line based on this movie, as well as a freaking storybook based on the film. Again, the movie was clearly marketed towards kids. But despite all the problems that the movie does have, and despite it being a commercial flop, the film has garnered a cult following, and now there are a lot of people who genuinely love this movie. And it's become this weird oddity for both fans of the book and for David Lynch fans, because compared to the rest of his filmography, this is such a strange outlier for him. Yet there are things in this movie that are so Lynchian, like everything dealing with the Harkonnens feels pure David Lynch, the fact that the Atreides have a thing for pugs, and even the opening narration where you have Princess Irulan basically explaining what spice is. Like, you see her come in and you see her fade out, and then she fades back in saying, oh, I forgot to tell you. Like, that just felt like a very David Lynch thing to do. And the fact that the film was so incomprehensible, even though it wasn't David Lynch's intention, it oddly enough gives the film a weird fever dream quality, which is honestly very in line with a lot of the stuff that David Lynch has done. But again, despite its flaws, I do like the movie. It's cheesy as fuck, and unless you've read the book, there's so much about the movie that really does not make sense. Also, to some degree, the movie does kind of miss the point of the book, because again, in the book, there's this sort of moral ambiguity to Paul where we're not completely sure if we should be rooting for him 100%, whereas in the movie, Paul is pretty much the hero throughout the whole film, and he even makes it rain on Arrakis at the end of the film, implying that he really was the hand of God, possibly even the second coming of Christ, which again, that's not what Frank Herbert was going for in the book. The whole point of the book is that Paul was a man playing God, but was not God himself, whereas the movies seem to completely miss that point entirely. Now, if you are a fan of the 1984 film, and if you're a collector of physical media, I highly recommend picking up the Blu-ray from Arrow Video. This has some really good special features, including 2 audio commentaries, one of which was actually done by Mike White, who does this podcast called The Projection Booth, which I've mentioned before. It's an amazing podcast. After the failure of the De Laurentiis David Lynch film, the rights to the book were purchased by producer Richard P. Rubenstein, who produced several of George Romero's movies like Dawn of the Dead, Day of the Dead, and Creepshow. He also produced several Stephen King adaptations like Creepshow, Pet Sematary, and The Stand. And he hired John Harrison, who had previously directed directed Tales from the Dark Side, the movie, to direct this new Dune adaptation. John Harrison also did the music for Creepshow and Day of the Dead. He was also the zombie who got the screwdriver in the head in the original Dawn of the Dead. So, the Richard P. Rubenstein, John Harrison Dune adaptation came in the form of a 3-part miniseries called Frank Herbert's Dune, which aired on the Sci-Fi Channel in 2000. Now, this is probably the most faithful adaptation of Dune, but unfortunately, being a made-for-TV production from the early 2000s, it really does suffer from a low budget and some honestly pretty questionable acting. And I'm sorry, some of the costumes in the movie look fucking ridiculous. And once again, it's probably the most faithful adaptation of Dune, but this is an example of how what works in a book does not always translate well to film or television in this case. Like, it really does suffer from that 90s, early 2000s made-for-TV cheese that, unfortunately, a lot of the Stephen King miniseries from around this time suffered from. One thing I will say that the 2000 miniseries did relatively well was it gave Princess Irulan a lot more agency, and let's be honest, a lot more character than she had in the original book, and especially in the David Lynch movie. But the miniseries was a pretty big hit, and it had a sequel in 2003 called Children of Dune, which adapted the second and third novels. And I think this actually was Sci-Fi Channel's first original miniseries, so it did kind of lead to stuff like Steven Spielberg's Taken and the early 2000s reboot of Battlestar Galactica. But in 2021, we finally got another film adaptation, this time directed by Denis Villeneuve. I'm not sure if I'm saying his name right, but he's actually one of my favorite modern filmmakers. He also directed movies like Prisoners, Enemy, and Sicario, which was one of my favorite films from last decade. But he's also made a huge name for himself in science fiction with movies like Arrival and Blade Runner 2049. Now, I'll admit, I have not seen the 2021 film since it came out, so my memory is a little hazy, but I remember liking it a lot. It does change a lot from the source material, and it streamlines certain things, but I'll be honest, for a story like Dune, you kinda have to. The movie starred Timothée Chalamet as Paul, Rebecca Ferguson as Lady Jessica, Oscar Isaac as Duke Leto Atreides, Jason Momoa as Duncan Idaho, Josh Brolin as Gurney Halleck, Javier Bardem as Stilgar, Zendaya as Chani, Dave Bautista as the Beast Rabond, David Dastmalchian, I'm not sure if I'm saying his last name right, but he played Piter, the same role that Brad Dourif played in the 84 film. And then you have Stellan Skarsgård as probably the scariest and most intimidating version of the Baron. And honestly, some of the designs for the Harkonnens feels almost Giger-esque, and I don't know if it's maybe a holdover or a tribute to the failed Jodorowsky production. And honestly, there are these almost surreal moments involving the Baron where he's like floating, and because his robe is so long, it almost looks like he's elongating, and he almost resembles a giant worm, which was probably done on purpose. And the worms in the movie look fantastic. Yes, it is CGI, but it really does capture the awe and horror that these creatures would inspire. But like I said, I haven't seen this one since it came out in 2021, but it had a sequel in 2024, Dune Part Two, which adapted the second half of the novel. Now, Part 2 is a lot fresher in my mind because I actually just rewatched it, and I really loved Dune Part 2. It was one of my favorite films of last year. And this one really does lay on thick that maybe we shouldn't be rooting for Paul 100%. Yes, he is leading the Fremen against their oppressors, but you realize that this might be leading to a bloody holy war, which again will result in the deaths of billions of people. And the movie also made several, in my opinion, pretty smart changes from the book. The fact that not all the Fremen believe in this prophecy, and even Paul in the beginning of the second movie, he doesn't want to be this messiah. He does want to fight with the Fremen against the Harkonnens, but he wants to fight alongside them as equals. And it's really the Lady Jessica who is pushing this whole messiah agenda, especially after she goes through that ritual and takes the water of life and becomes the Reverend Mother. She basically becomes a different person after that and almost seems possessed, and is genuinely pretty creepy, and eventually Paul does start to embrace his role as the Muad'Dib, or the Lisa Malgaib, and when he takes the water of life, he also becomes a very different person, and I think Timothée Chalamet really is given a chance to shine as an actor in this movie. Like, we see the change that he goes through, and when he starts rallying the Fremen, it's actually kinda chillin'. But Javier Bardem really does steal the movie as Stilgar. Like, he is funny in the film, but also shows the dangers of blind faith. And the movie really does change the characterization of Chani, where Chani does love Paul, but she also sees through the bullshit. And she realizes that these prophecies, these legends, are just another way for her people to be controlled and oppressed. You also had Austin Butler as Feyd-Rautha, who did a very good job in the movie. Like, Feyd is fucking scary, almost scarier than the Baron. Dune Part Two also seemed to take a cue from the 2000 miniseries, where it gave Princess Irulan a lot more agency and a lot more characterization, and Irulan in the movie was played very well by Florence Pugh. And then you had Christopher fucking Walken as Emperor Shaddam IV, and just the cast of Dune Part 2 was so incredible. But throughout the movie, Walken plays the Emperor as this frail, almost pathetic old man that you sort of feel sorry for, but then by the end of the movie, he becomes genuinely pretty intimidating and almost feels like an old mob boss. But yeah, I loved Dune Part 2. Honestly, putting both movies together, I think Denis Villeneuve did probably the best adaptation of Dune. Both movies do change a lot from the source material, but I think they stay true to the tone and spirit of the novel. And apparently they are going to be doing a Dune Part 3, which will adapt the second novel, Dune Messiah, which I'm very curious to see what they do with that, especially because the ending of Part 2 does alter a little bit from the ending of the book. Now, you also have the HBO Max series, Dune Prophecy, which I haven't watched yet, but I'm pretty sure it's supposed to be in continuity with the Villeneuve films. But I think it's set beforehand, and from what I understand, I think it mainly focuses on the Bene Gesserit. Now, Dune has also had multiple comic book and video game adaptations. Now, Dune has inspired so much going forward. Like, without Dune, Star Wars probably wouldn't exist, at least not in the same way. Yes, the themes of Star Wars are a little more simplistic. Star Wars is a much more straightforward story of good versus evil. But there are similarities between Luke Skywalker's journey in the original Star Wars trilogy and Paul Atreides' journey, and spice is even referenced in the first Star Wars movie. In the first movie, when Luke first finds out that his father was a Jedi, keep in mind, this is before we find out that Luke's father was actually Darth Vader, but when Obi-Wan Kenobi is telling Luke that his father was a Jedi, Luke Skywalker's like, "No, that's not true. My father was a navigator on a spice freighter." Also, there are similarities between Tatooine, Luke Skywalker's home planet, and Arrakis. And in the third Star Wars movie, you have the Sarlacc pit, which could maybe be considered kind of a worm. Admittedly, the similarities between Dune and Star Wars are superficial, but they certainly are there. You could also see the influence of Dune in the Chronicles of Riddick movies. You could also see Dune's influence in several fantasy works like George R.R. Martin's Song of Fire and Ice series, which is what Game of Thrones was based on. Honestly, I even saw some influences of Dune in Stephen King's Dark Tower series. Like, there are certain aspects of Roland Deschaines' backstory that are similar to Paul's backstory. Even the whole dynamic between Roland and his father is somewhat similar to Paul's dynamic with his father. There are even some similarities between the fall of House Atreides in Dune and the fall of Gilead in the Dark Tower universe. And speaking of Stephen King, he did a short story called Beach World, which appeared in his collection Skeleton Crew, and that story was about these two astronauts who get stranded on a planet of sand, and I feel like that story might have been at least partly inspired by Dune. There's even a scene in the original Phantasm where Mike goes to see this girl whose grandmother is sort of a mystic, and they make him put his hand in this box, and it starts hurting his hand, and it's very, very similar to the Gom Jabbar scene from Dune. The demon sandworms from Tim Burton's Beetlejuice, I think, were definitely meant as a Dune reference. Even the Gravoids in Tremors, I feel, had to have been inspired by the sandworms from Dune. Dune has also been parodied multiple times throughout pop culture. So yeah, guys, that was my long as shit review of Dune by Frank Herbert. Remember to always put spice on your food, just be aware of the side effects.